people are always talking about great societal changes. My background is quantitative social science, so I rely on being able to measure things. It doesn't mean it's the right way, but it gives you a different perspective to just looking at political events and saying that's a big swing. So the kind of things I measure are how long people live for, their self-reported rates of health, but also their income, their wealth, and things like when they have children. So lots and lots of numbers. When you go back in time, you get fewer numbers, and so what I do is, if you like, biased by the fact we don't have as much information. But the kind of big swings that interest me are, just take the age at which people have children, and it differs by country. But in the UK, people were having their children youngest in the 1960s, 1970s. Way back in the 30s and 20s, they were on average having them at an older age, and now again, they're having them at an older age. So you can imagine a graph where you have a big swing, early 1920s, people begin to have children a bit earlier, and then another swing in the 1970s as they stop having them quite so young, and no sign of a swing on that at the moment. Now, it's when the swings coincide that I get excited. So that pattern for age of first birth, you see the same thing in terms of income inequality. The UK was incredibly unequal in the early 1920s. Many people were servants. In fact, to be a servant was the most common job for women, which it's very hard to have a child if you're a servant living in a house. So you can begin to connect things like income inequality and the age at which people have children. We became the most equal we'd ever been in the UK by the 60s and 70s economically. And it wasn't just that people were having, I won't go on about having children, it's just an interesting, simple statistic. Almost everybody had children at the same early age. You know, the Queen had them early in her 20s. The working class had them in their 20s. A few people had children as teenagers, but not that many. Now, and this is not just UK, all across Europe, average age is around 31, 32, but it's bimodal. Poorer people have them a little bit earlier, richer people are having them later, even in their early 40s. And I'm interested in how the big economic and political and social and societal swings of our societies affect our everyday lives, including something as really important and basic as to, you know, do we become parents? At what age do we become parents? And to what extent is that not in our power? It's because of the times and the places that we've been living through.
And what, because you're talking there about multiple swings, did I make a mistake already, potentially, in kind of asking almost as a singular, like a big swing in society? Is it what you're looking at, multiple different threads that come together and sometimes might produce something that feels like a big phenomenon, but actually there's constantly these kinds of different shifts happening?
Oh, there's constantly lots of small changes happening, and sometimes bigger. And I mean, the big take home from that is that when people get too depressed and say things are utterly awful, the chances of them actually staying that way for decades is almost zero. I mean, it's amazing how much life does change. We tend to take it for granted. Some things get worse, but a lot of things, more things tend to get better than get worse. I mean, that's, at a very simple level, there are more older people living in the world than ever before because they managed to get through and be able to get to that age. You know, and that's a major human achievement. It's when the swings coincide, and particularly coincide across countries, that it's very hard not to say that something huge has occurred. The income inequality swing, it was very similar across all of Europe. In the early 1920s, every European country began to become a bit more equal. And we instantly tried to come up with reasons for this. The First World War is an obvious one. It was a very expensive war. It went on for a long time. The only way in which countries could pay their debts because they decided they were going to pay back the people that they borrowed money from to fight those wars. The only way to pay back the debts initially was to tax the rich. That immediately reduced social inequalities. In the UK, large numbers of country houses were donated to the National Trust. Okay, but essentially they were taxed. It's when you see slight differences, you can realise it's specific to one continent. I'm very focused on rich countries. I'm aware of this. My excuse is the data. The USA didn't partake in this 1920s, 1930s change. It remained very unequal in the 1920s and 30s, and it was only after the Second World War that the USA joined in with the other rich countries of the world and saw income inequality fall and people's lives become more similar. The turn in the 70s was pretty universal for rich countries. The current position isn't. We have a huge range of different experiences in different countries. Now, we have some of the most equitable countries in world history are alive and kicking right now. There are 15 countries in Europe which include the 5 Scandinavian, the 5 Nordic countries, but 5 of the 15 are slightly more equal than them, and 5 of the 15 are almost as equal, including France and Germany. So at the same time as this is going on in Europe, that a lot of Europe is doing pretty well when it comes to equality between people in general. The UK and a few other peripheral European nations, Hungary and Russia, have kind of gone off on the spree to great inequality, and the USA is just going off the scale internationally. You know, it's comparable to China, not quite as bad as Brazil and South Africa, but so currently something's going on, you know, and it's always, you've always got to be wary of trying to understand your present times that you're living through. Something's going on, but it isn't uniform globally. Whereas that 70s turn was fairly uniform, and the beginnings of greater equality happening in the 1920s was fairly uniform. And you can go earlier. It gets tricky, but it does matter because people often say that the post-war period was unique and rare. If you go back further in time, you find swings happening earlier. For white folk in the USA, 1840, 1850, they had quite an equitable life. But, yeah, because they weren't being controlled so much by very rich folk. And there were other connections. They were incredibly tall. Whenever you get society doing well, people tend to get healthier and get taller. When it does badly, they can actually get shorter even in modern times. It occurs. So you measure these things in as many ways as you can, and when you get the most concentrated set of correlating trends, I think then it's fair to say, well, something big happened that's really important, and then you try to guess, well, what was it?
Well, that brings me to what is kind of like a combination of about 3 or 4 different questions that I'm going to try and make into one. And then Eddie, if you want to come in after this one. I think I've seen you do a talk before, Danny, where you've kind of perhaps deliberately, provocatively, basically said, or maybe not, like governments don't make a difference. Yeah. Because you see such big swings, and sometimes they coincide with what you think of as being the kind of political persuasion of the government, but often it doesn't, and there's a lag. Anyway, what are at least 2 of the questions that I had were, can we consciously make a difference to these swings? And what are some of the common things that seem to contribute to them? I mean, that's hard to answer without picking out a specific swing. So let's talk about economic equality or inequality, since that is like obviously such a major focus for you. Yeah,
so democratic governments don't make as much of a difference as we think. That doesn't mean they're not important, but I've written papers where I've drawn a little dot on graphs for every general election in the UK, and there was not nothing happens for most elections. The trend doesn't shift even an iota before or after an election, even when the political party has changed. So that gradual improvement in equality from the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, the 1945 general election doesn't accelerate it at all, even though in folklore we talk about this amazing Labour landslide in 1934 and the introduction of the welfare state. And by seeing that the elections were not that important, it helps you look and think, well, what was happening before 1945? How was the politics in Britain changing that made the welfare state possible, and get you away from this heroes of the left kind of narrative that they came in and stormed the barricades. The swing elections in this trend, there were 2 elections in 1974 in the UK. And what's interesting about that is that although few people remember those elections as being very important, the time at which it was turning in the UK and elsewhere around was the early 70s, not the 1979 election that we all remember because Margaret Thatcher came in. And I haven't looked much at the USA. I don't, because the problem is you have to look at everything and you can't. But I suspect that the election of Reagan in 1980 was actually a symptom of something that was beginning before and was there, and you could see it in the trends. But because it becomes obvious at that point that something new is going on, then that gets marked down in history as being the key event. And we give Reagan too much, and the people behind Reagan too much agency, just as we probably gave Margaret Thatcher and the people behind her too much agency. It had begun to alter already. What tends to happen in countries is that the major political parties tend to be very similar to each other. Within a country, you don't think that. You think, oh, in the USA, you think there's an enormous difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, particularly now, a country absolutely riven, incredibly riven by beliefs. But from a European point of view, the policies of the Democrats and the Republicans, it's very hard to see the difference between, the warmongering is similar, not wanting to introduce a decent health service, which most of the rich world has got, is similar. Thinking it's okay to have a tiny amount of public housing and not, even a safety net. Being sanguine over 2 million people in prisons. The 2 political parties in the USA look very similar. Similarly for the UK. Barring a few years of great difference, not much really, the British Labour Party and the British Conservative Party have been remarkably similar in terms of policy. It's things like military policy and supporting the H-bomb back in the 1950s. But compared to many European political parties, a European left-wing social democratic party will tend to be far to the left of the British Labour Party. Or even the Conservative Party, the Christian Democrats under Angela Merkel, had policies that were actually to the left of Jeremy Corbyn. People lament, in any country you go to, people take politics very seriously, which is really important. So currently in Finland, people are saying, oh, it's terrible, we've got a right-wing government. It wouldn't look right-wing from the point of view of the USA or UK. You move all your politics in one direction or another. And those big swings, the 1920s and 1970s swings, were when all the parties moved towards the left after the 1920s. And after the 1970s, they all moved towards the right in the UK. In different European countries, they didn't go as far at all. So the UK has been an international reckoning of every political party in the world, in a rich country and a middle income country. And under Liz Truss, the British Conservatives had the most right-wing economic policy of any political party on the planet. And Labour were not, Labour looked to the right of all the social democratic parties over what they're willing to countenance, or they even think of as possible. So we have a budget coming up in the UK very soon, and we're not allowed to discuss the idea that we maybe could move towards being like Germany or like France. That's off the table. We're told that the room for manoeuvre is tiny. And in fact, it's not even that we're not allowed to discuss whether we can look at the models of other European countries. We're not even allowed to even talk about whether we could. It's just not there at all in the debate about the budget. Yeah, no suggestion that maybe, and that shows you where a country is at the moment. And it will be a seismic shift. You know, if a Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, or if politicians in the USA seriously said, let's look at the rest of the world and pick and choose, and to what extent can we pick and choose policies that have made people's lives better? I mean, it would be, I would guess, almost seen as traitorous to suggest that somewhere else in the world might do things better. And then you know you're in a weird situation if that's how it is. Whereas for a small affluent country, they're always looking at other places to see, you know, policy on railways. Another country taxes air flights and so on. And you can see countries copying policies of each other, but not so much the UK or the USA. I should say there is one country that the UK copied, and of course that was the USA. So famously, Gordon Brown, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer of the Labour, would go to the States every summer to kind of learn lessons from the States of what we could implement. Now, Gordon Brown is our most left-wing Prime Minister since the 60s. And he went to the United States it is geographically ridiculous, you know, because there's so many other places he could have gone if he knew another language other than English.
I think I'm curious to know, based on that leading into, I'm curious to think, when you mention this kind of threading together of things that are common across different countries, different government systems that are related to this idea of understanding what the context of a big swing in the past has been. And I know he asked about the idea of, like, are there characteristics that led to big swings? I'm curious, have you seen trends about what countries' governments measure in terms of understanding how well they're doing? So, and to contextualize, for instance, when you say, like, the US, like right now, it might feel weird in the US to say, who's doing this better? I'm not even sure what scale we would even be using other than an American person said it or did it. You know, I'm not sure what scales we're using to even evaluate that. So I'm curious to see what.
You're right. I mean, one reason I haven't tried to do much on the USA is, can you imagine somebody with my accent talking about the USA? You know, I kind of know I'm onto a loser. I could write the most brilliant quantitative social science book about the USA. It's not going to be read. I mean, there are ideas about hermegamy, global hermegamy, who's in charge, who's big. And the UK was, you have to go back 2 centuries, and so a whole load of things were dominated by British thinking, British power, and so on. And then, of course, the USA rises that position. And so countries are still dominated by measures invented in the USA. GDP was invented by an American economist. And, you know, we still take it very seriously when GDP goes up or down a little bit. And what's amusing about the GDP measure is it's so hard to measure that even the best government statistical agency gets it wrong in the first 3 or 6 months. They have to revise it. So whenever they tell you you're in a recession, they're not really sure. The other one, standard one, and again, it comes from the past, is unemployment, which, and it may sound odd to say that unemployment is a US measure, but when the UK was hegemonic in the world, we had no unemployment because the concept wasn't there. If you didn't work, you starved to death, right? Unemployment can only exist if you have a benefit that you give out because of it. People were, I mean, we had poor laws and we had workhouses and we had other things, but in essence, it was only really with the general crash in 1929 that unemployment was properly recognized, and then becomes a measure. But the measure we use is still very much that 1930s measure of, are you available for work? Are you going out and looking for it? health measures are, if you like, the big one, which is free of this, and there are various ways in which you can measure health. They are in a way they don't get great currency, partly because the country which did best on health is Japan, and we don't like to think about Japan actually having the most successful social policies in a way, and it's an outlier for the general trends. What my story about what happened in Japan. Japan used to be a really unequal country. There were two countries in the 1930s that saw huge increases in economic inequality. Those two countries were Germany and Japan. And it's 1930. So, in hindsight, you could see trouble ahead. Mm-hmm. So Japan was very, very unequal, had low life expectancy. There's nothing about a healthy Far Eastern diet. But after the war, the USA impinged equality on Japan. It redistributed the land from the aristocracy and the rich as equally as it could, because the USA was afraid of a revolution in Japan, afraid of Russia moving in, afraid of it becoming communist, and a bit embarrassed about the number of babies that had been aborted in Japan. It was millions. There was a fear of this will be seen as a kind of, and of course dropping 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. Anyway, the USA, not for a natural experiment, but because it wanted Russia not to get bigger, made Japan economically very equal. And there were 2 big results. One was that works really well for your economy. People are happier when they work harder, when they're not treated badly. And the rich behave really well when they're not very rich. And the second is that life expectancy rose and rose and rose. So it's one of the highest in the world in Japan. So health measures are another. There have been many other instigated since the 70s. The ones I quite like are life satisfaction and happiness measures, where we ask people, and these questions may sound simplistic, but the trick is you just ask the same question again and again. You ask people how anxious they are on a scale of 1 to 10. You ask them how satisfied they are with life. They're often questions that are linked to the questions we use for individuals to try to assess their mental health. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about those, I've looked at them recently in the UK. David Cameron, he became Prime Minister around about 2010. He told the Office of National Statistics we had to have a happiness measure, and he was going to make the country happier. And then the fascinating thing was, this has been published every month since shortly after then. The levels of satisfaction did actually rise after 2010. And this is why I say you should really look at numbers, because it was a period of austerity. It felt terrible. We had a coalition Liberal Tory government who were cutting as much as they could. And then we got a Tory government in 2015, and then we got a Brexit vote, and then we had mayhem. But all the time, levels of satisfaction were actually rising. If you break it down by age, you'll see that they are rising the most in older people and not in the young. And what it tells you, I think, is that the old were getting what they wanted. The old want Conservative governments. They don't want Labour. The old want lower taxes. They want things to be cut, and they wanted Brexit. But the young didn't. Mm. The point at which for the UK that the happiness index failed or sharply went down and anxiety spiked was when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister in 2019. And it was almost like a heart attack. You can see it in the graphs. It shot up because there were enough people so upset about him becoming Prime Minister, because this meant that we were going to leave Europe. And it's not as big a thing as Texas leaving the USA, but it's as close as you can get to that. If you imagine, we were free to travel. There weren't borders. There weren't borders. And now there are definitely borders. And our goods cost more, and we had to pay customs and so on. And the sadness of that event on the British public outweighed those people who celebrated it. And levels of anxiety rose to a height. And the way I love to measure this is that we have one event that was just as bad as Johnson becoming Prime Minister for anxiety. And that was the second wave of COVID. Like the pandemic coming back at the end of 2020, and the realization, even though we had vaccines, that this disease wasn't going to go away, was slightly more frightening than the election of that one politician. So individual elections can matter for different things, but it was a shock. Johnson was our little Trump, if you like. You know, not as bad as Donald Trump at all, but in a British perspective, to elect a man who is the most irresponsible politician probably in modern history, whose one of his first actions was to remove the whip from a series of moderate conservative MPs, and then do things which were illegal, such as proroguing Parliament, lie to the Queen, that doesn't go down well, and push through this divorce with Europe rather than try and accommodate anything. So it's an interesting thing, but a one-off event that you can measure the effects of it in terms of how people answer a question which is personal. It's not about Johnson or politics at all. It's about how anxious do you feel today, and then watch it collectively spike. So we can say that was really important, but it was a one-off, and then we got a pandemic, and that fixated minds in a different way.
Mm-hmm. I find that super interesting, especially because, well, in many ways, and I think I'm curious to know your thoughts about this, because even in terms of people self-evaluating where they find themselves related to anxiety or stress, I think I found or kind of hold that people define those things differently based on their their story or their context for it.
Yeah.
As an example, I was working in a space where, supporting senior leaders, and we're asking the leaders to say, hey, we want to make sure that some of the highest members of this organization have a good experience with the board and CEOs and things. And there was a kind of a perspective that goes, well, we get compensated to manage the stress of this kind of position, and we are imbued with power to be at this certain level of anxiety and concern, and it's connected to how I afford and access to things that I need, as well as which I think can be that intense in that role, or it could be I'm in school and I'm struggling with that, because to be smart is to struggle through the education system, not to be supported through it in a way that makes it easier. Yeah. And so, but all of that to say that sometimes that context can almost distort how we self-identify.
Oh, yeah. Self-identifying is incredibly difficult. We will all say, if we're candid, how we feel, but we don't know how it relates to other people. There was a lovely series of studies of civil servants done in Britain, involving Michael Marmot, who's now famous for health equality. But he was looking at the stress of civil servants, and senior civil servants, permanent secretaries to the minister right at the top, would say they're very stressed. But he also took blood samples and measured the level of dopamines and anxiety. And what was interesting, I paraphrase the research now, but the actual physical measures of stress in blood were highest for people at the bottom of the civil service. Back then, it was, in my head, I hope I haven't got this wrong, postboy. This was a time when there were more men in the civil service, but the very bottom level was being the person who sorted the post out into pigeonholes in the basement of the building. Now, and his interpretation of this was that actually the most stressful jobs you can have are the ones where you have almost no control over what you do. When you're in charge, I cannot imagine being in charge. This department I'm in has 500 people. I absolutely fear the idea of them ever making me in charge of it, and hopefully they won't. They're allowed to, but hopefully they won't. However, when we actually measure the heart rate and so on of people in those positions, although relatively to other times in their lives this might be stressful, they live for a long time. They're not suffering a kind of stress that gives them an early death, which other people in other jobs have. So it's relative. It doesn't mean it's not a useful measure. As soon as you ask 1,000 people about their level of anxiety, and then you ask them again a month later or 2 months later, you find something out that is useful. The change is meaningful in the average. It doesn't mean you know why it's gone up or down, but if it goes up or down, it almost certainly has. A bit like when you poll people on political opinions. You know, when it drops by 5%, there really has been a drop. Yeah, and this is what's useful about statistics. Is as soon as you've got a decent number of folk, you can say something that's going on. And why, when I saw the anxiety levels rising in the young and falling in the old, coincidence with political events, which from the point of view of the young, the world is getting much and much worse. We're burning it, we don't care, we're taking away their freedoms, we're making life easier for the old. And you're trying to understand, as many people are trying to understand, why are young people getting more anxious? Is it real anxiety? You look at it from that point of view and you have a reason for it, and you go, okay, it's not just that it feels reasonable. I know young people, they do seem worried, but they are collectively getting worried conveniently in a pattern in time and space that makes sense. So their mental health is worse in the most unequal countries and the ones going in the wrong direction. In the more equal countries, even though young people still have poor mental health, they have the best mental health in the planet. It's always described as poor. But if I was a really, really good parent, I would have moved my family to one of these countries for the sake of my children. But we don't make calculations like that.
Yeah, and I'll end and I'll pass it back to Matt. But it's interesting because there's also this. I think there's something interesting about the social. Like we talk a lot about the idea of our context socially is often inherited, and so people don't often start at zero. You know, like you're not at a baseline that you kind of create and set your norm of what anxiety is. I think some people level set to anxiety that is considered their baseline.
Yeah.
But it's a level of anxiety that they're used to carrying on a consistent, regular basis.
Yeah.
And I think that, like to your point about the level of anxiety being higher amongst people who feel that they don't have the capacity to, the level of agency or control over the work that they do being higher, it makes me also think about how might that be reflected in when we think about social conditions that control people's sense of control over their lives.
Absolutely enormous. I mean, one of the most obvious one is men and women. So women in numerous surveys will on average worry more than men. When the pandemic came out, we took 82 social surveys our government did. One was every 2 weeks. Brilliant. During the pandemic, and women were twice as likely to be worried about this pandemic than men. Men were, I'm generalizing, but this is part of what it means to be a man and be a woman, which is men are much more likely to be gung-ho, it'll all be okay, get through like that. If you look at, as I saw for our students, we just looked at how many of them are concerned about how they're doing in their degrees. The women are twice as likely to be worrying about their PhD than the men. It's actually a 10 on average to be a bit careful, and they're less likely to have a problem, but they worry. So there's something that now it's probably societal, it's probably not to do with genes, and of course the position of women has changed dramatically over 100 years, but there's nowhere near equality about why that might be. Social positions, I can do my job relatively easily because my social background, my social class is quite high. My parents, my grandparents, and so on. I'm not intimidated to work at the University of Oxford because I don't find posh people intimidating. But I only don't find them intimidating because they were my family. It's not, I don't have imposter syndrome. It's easy. I'm at least, I feel like I recognize it is. But I can sit in the room with my vice chancellor and I'm not in awe of where she's come from or who she is. And there's nothing anybody who hasn't had my social background can do to give themselves the confidence that I have. And this isn't because I went to an elite school, I went to a normal school. It's because when I was age 3 and 5 and 7 and 10, I was meeting people like the people I now work with, and I was the poshest boy in my normal school. Now, a perfect education for dealing with the University of Oxford. So there are these huge differences by social group as well. The other thing which I think happens is that I think, and the evidence is only tangential, but people on the political left, we tend not to think that we are that special. We're very good at arguments about, actually, we're not that special. We've only got to where we are because of advantages. Everybody has a lot to give. But if you don't think you're that special, it's quite hard to be running one of these organizations. Whereas if you do think that you are the bee's knees, that you're the man, and a million other people are just really inferior to you, and you should be where you are, then getting up and going into the office at 8 in the morning and giving out orders, I suspect is far easier for people of that political disposition, where they actually believe they're superior, than it is for people who are correct that they're not superior, but find themselves in a position of power. And that's one problem we have in how we organize our societies, because narcissists tend to rise to the top because they don't find it difficult to be in those positions, and we need to be wary of what that then does.
I could easily keep going, but
Yeah.
We'll come. Well, I was just going to come in only because we've been talking about people's sort of conscious awareness, I suppose, of their society and their surroundings and their class and all those forces. And we also touched on government and the influence the government has. This, I suppose, what I want to ask then, Danny, is everything just social forces that we're kind of unaware of and incapable of managing and seeing for ourselves?
Social forces are the most important thing. There are 8 billion of us, and how we organize ourselves is almost entirely social. It's not the economy, right? It's not politics. It is how humans think of and deal with other humans. The worst examples, if we think of other human beings as not being human, it allows us to do terrible things. And we've done this throughout history. We did it to women. Women were barely human 100 years ago. We've done it by race. You can't have slavery without thinking of people as being subhuman, and you can't have mass killings in countries and get away with it without actually enough people not thinking that the people who are being killed are human. We're all locked. We're all locked in our little world of what we understand. I worry, even saying that, I worry I sound overconfident, right? One nice thing about getting older is the older I get, the more I understand how much I don't understand it is like to be a woman growing up in Britain. It's interesting what the women of my age will tell me now about things. I grew up in a mixed race family. I have 2 black brothers and 1 white brother. That's a different experience for many people, but it doesn't mean I understand black folk that well. It just means, I grew up in a mixed race family. But I've got no idea what it's like to grow up worrying about not having enough food. I don't, I could try to imagine that, but it doesn't work the same as and people I know who have grown up not enough food have never really explained it to me, or can't, or you wouldn't understand. And we'll always be limited by this. We are an animal which evolved to quite happily cope in groups of 20, 30 or 40 of people with very similar experiences to us, largely related to us. What we've been trying to do since we invented cities is to be more magnanimous about this. But I think we overestimate our scope to do it, and we have to collectively work out how are we going to try to appreciate other people's positions better than we do. I think we're also a bit mean on ourselves, because this situation of most of us having to be magnanimous is really very recent. We only invented tractors just, I don't know, 120 years ago. So 120 years ago, the vast majority of people in the world were working in villages, on farms, bringing in crops. This was, this is 4 generations ago, 5 generations ago. Yeah, our lives were village lives, all very parochial lives in part of the town. And suddenly, we've got to a situation where 1/3 of the young people in the world are going to university. We have international travel. We can talk to each other like this, right? This is so new, so recent, that I don't think we should get down about the fact that we're not very good at it. Because, my grandparents were born before the first flight occurred, before the first aeroplane, and then watched somebody think it was a good idea to put a man on the moon. and it, yeah, and that change is so recent. So the amazing thing is that we're still here. I think we should look at it like that way, and celebrate things like the thousands of unknown and unnamed individuals who managed to stop various nuclear accidents and wars happening that will have got very close. We don't tend to even know the stories of the people who stopped things being much worse than they currently are.
Yeah. I mean, I think certainly part of what Commonplace and what we're trying to do is develop that practice, I suppose, and if it's okay to say, Danny, I think in sort of empathy and understanding that you're referring to. And like you say, it's something that we are recognizing now is perhaps something missing in society, where we don't, and we know that also structurally spaces for that kind of activity are also diminishing because of economic, political imperatives. What I think we can imagine, though, coming back to your point about, is it possible for us to know what it would feel like to grow up as that person without food? We can imagine what it would be like for us not to have food, and we can imagine what feels fair and what feels right. Do you think that there is still the possibility, therefore, of us collectively being more engaged in making those kind of decisions about what society should do? Even if we can't personally live it and experience it, we can imagine what we would expect from society.
Oh, I mean, I think you can measure a huge increase in empathy amongst the young in general. It's not a short-term fad. The worrying about how words come over, how you be, the phrases that are sometimes talked down about knowing your position. It's not a short-term fad. It is a switch as big as the switch in the 1960s of thinking about other people. But when you say can we, I think it's so much easier if you are brought up in that environment. So the younger you are, the easier it will be if you're given a situation that allows you to do that. And I personally believe it's measurable, and it's often dealt with in a way today where people pour scorn on the sensibilities of younger people in general. But to me, it looks like a sea change without much evidence of a switch back again. And the fascinating thing, if I pretend I'm not a human being and I don't care, the fascinating thing about this is just watching the power of it and thinking, how on earth did this happen? And then worrying, is it that so many people's parents or grandparents sounded so out of touch to them that they've moved to these other ways of thinking? But you see it in opinion polls as soon as they're dissected by age. It's faster in women. That's the way I would put it. Rather than worrying about, is there a group of men going nasty? I think young men are just, some of them, a little bit more behind. But it's faster in women than it is in men. And it absolutely appears to be there. It is trying to put yourselves in other people's shoes and to think about the position. Sexuality is the very obvious one. But more generally, people have an awareness now that couldn't even be imagined. I've got my grandfather's diary just over on the side here from the 1930s, where he talks about going to a meeting of suffragettes and just how interesting they were and what a strange concept it was that they thought they should be taken seriously. Okay. But obviously, I think it was a bit bored of just being in rooms of men. And so I think we can be optimistic. It's just that we are observing something that is very hard to understand because it's collective. It's not about individual people. This is collective behavior. And you won't fit in if you're not nice so much now as you could have fitted in the past. I mean, when I was young, patriotism was just a norm. The comics we had as children were all, for boys, were all about fighting wars. You know, they were literally, the children's comics were about having guns and shooting Germans. You know, the world is changing. The majority of school teachers are women, relatively young women, not the men who taught me. And we're very, very bad at noticing good general social changes because we concentrate on the bad things that are happening, particularly at the top of politics. And we don't, it's just taken for granted that, yes, of course, society has changed in this way. It didn't have to. And of course, it may not. It does require people carrying on saying that this really matters. I should say, by the way, it's not just the young. There's been a protest recently in the UK where more than 2,000 people, the majority of whom were over 65, have got themselves arrested to try to stop a law. Now, okay, they're over 65, so they're not working and they're not maybe doing childcare, so they can get arrested. But they are, to stereotype them, largely people from that 1960s generation. And they're still in their old age doing a 1960s style protest. And in the UK, because our courts are in disarray and not huge, our government can't cope with 2,000 people being arrested. It can't actually charge them all. So, you know, before anybody thinks I'm putting all my hopes in the young, there are older people, but it's quite rare to be a radical old person. Whereas the other way around, it's quite rare to be a nasty young right-wing person, and that's good. That the fact that change is happening is good.
Yeah. I think I find this so interesting because I've done a couple sessions about specifically like awareness and empathy and like social understanding, and I've said before that, you know, actually Maya Angelou quoted someone, I forget what it was from, where she says, "Nothing that is human can be alien to me." And I sat with that, and it was a part of me teaching race relations in the US. And I was thinking to myself, you know, there could be one decision different, and I could have been born into a family with a racist grandmother who, from the outside, is just all you see is the racism. But from my perspective, this is the grandmother who baked my favorite desserts growing up, or I would spend the summer with, and who was not showing me something that was an issue or a problem. She was showing me something that was more than likely a part of an inherited idea that was passed down to her, and so on and so forth. And so when we talk about the social systems, there's that layer of it that's very interpersonal. And I think that even that's very uncomfortable for people to sit with. But I think that there are even the larger, the things which is why I find so interesting about your work of talking about big swings in society, these big levers that determine, that may, or at least show signs for us to look for. Why do people have children at a certain time? And how did that correlate to geopolitics that were happening? And in all of that is the social narrative that the people experiencing it made to make sense of their reality. And that became a sense of the norm, right? Regardless to how accurate that storytelling or description of why and how and the motivations and levers for why a thing was happening or a social reality was happening was true or not, right? And
Yeah.
so, and I think that with that, even at that scale, that's a pretty large scale of thinking about it in those terms. And I think you also signal that it gets even larger because we can zoom out even further and think about, well, to your point, if in a certain point in history, everyone was essentially running homesteads, and then now we're having to figure out how to run a society that can't actually house millions of homesteads for people to make themselves. And so now we have to find a way of doing society, providing and meeting needs that doesn't align with that way of working. And we've arrived at this point at rapid speed. What kind of social stories have we written to explain how this all works, how normal it is, how unchangeable it all is, that is really just people as quickly as possible trying to make sense of levers that we may not have had the ability to see without work from scholars like you and other people who have been doing these kind of studies to make that visible. And I know I just dumped a lot right there, but this is the in my mind, like this is the difficulty of the weaving of social change, system change, is that you kind of first, in a way, have to show people the tangled knot that is the society that we're currently maintaining. And so again, I know that was a lot to drop, but I'm curious.
No. It's great. It's, having to navigate a city of strangers. Even my little city is largely a city of strangers. I was cycling in today, and a man stopped his car so I could cycle past him, and he nodded at me, and I nodded back. And this is this is a thing we've created only in relatively recent times. The acknowledgements of strangers in your community to get by, and it makes you happy if you do it. And you give somebody else space, and there's nothing in it for you other than it wouldn't work if you didn't do this. Seeing everybody as human is really important. I have a lovely aunt, they're now very old, who used to get really upset when we said anything nasty about Margaret Thatcher. She didn't agree with Margaret Thatcher, but my aunt was a Catholic, and she used to go, "She's got a soul too, And I always thought, and I think seeing your political opponents as human. I mean, poor Margaret Thatcher died alone in a very expensive hotel, not knowing where she was or who she was, and seeing everybody as human, including your opponents, is really important. I recently read in the States, I never knew this, that there's a very famous poem which begins, I think, first they came for the communists and I was not a communist, then they came for the socialists, and they came from a trade union and so on, and then they came from the Jews. But the poem was written by a pastor, a Christian pastor, who, it turns out, and I didn't know this, was vehemently anti-communist and vehemently anti-socialist and probably anti-Semitic as well, and didn't like trade unions. So yes, and he had a sea change, of course, in his own beliefs, and later in life he accepted many different people. But if you know about that story in the poem, then part of the argument of appreciating the poem is, even people and groups that you really, really don't like, you shouldn't wish on them terrible things to occur. And if we're going to cope with people who've got anger in them, just making them more angry isn't the way of doing it. And it's a hard lesson. So it doesn't mean you don't call out things you don't agree with, but you don't demonize other people. And when that becomes common, that you just don't demonize people, even if you really object to what a group is doing, but you try to understand them, in theory, that should spread a better way of being. And we're going to have to do this because we suddenly exploded in population numbers. We're going to go down after the year 2070 probably, but there's going to be 8, 9, 10 billion of us, maybe down to 7. But for a long time to come, we're going to be living in cities. We're going to be living with strangers. And we're going to have to work out how to do it, and we have to work out how to control a small proportion of people who are very greedy, because they don't need to be clever. The people, you don't have to be a genius to end up with billions and billions of dollars, right? And I think we used to think, oh, don't worry, only a few clever people will get all that money, and they'll create a giant supermarket that might be useful for us, or they might endow us with libraries. No. Somebody very dumb can become a multi-billionaire, and they can be very dangerous. And we've learned, and this is a new thing that we've learned.
Yeah.
And we need to protect ourselves from people who will do that, but also see them as human. See their weaknesses. Don't be mean that they're not really very clever, or that they have a personality trait, which means that they don't worry about what other people think about them, and that allowed them to get to the position, as well as almost always having a rich dad. That tends to be involved.
Yeah.
But this is new. You couldn't have said 30 or 40 years ago that the richest people on the planet now would be a set of men who are not especially gifted. That's happened, but we need to learn from it. And the problem is, of course, they have the money, and some of them really, really believe in their own theories of how the world should be, and they're going to pay people to promulgate those theories. But up against them are millions of folk who just think this isn't right.
Yeah, it's so well. One, Matt knows, because I bring this. Well, we talk about this all the time, but it leans into, again, like one of the deepest, richest. I think one of the rich parts of the work that we're trying to do, which is kind of illuminating, to your exact point. Right now, we are, because of how society works, we are currently codependent, interdependent on people we deeply disagree with. There is someone right now who is participating in society in a way that is contributing to holding it together in a way that is benefiting people that you care about and you have deeper disagreements with. And when I think about that, because it's a part of, I think, cutting through the illusion that the sides somehow actually separate us. Because it doesn't. It just makes the quality of how we engage with each other and the quality of the systems that we maintain and tolerate for each other more inclusive of suffering that we kind of reserve for the stranger we find deserving of it.
We have to do this. Otherwise, we end up in a nihilistic situation. So a book's just been published in the UK about universities that I've had so many emails saying, "Oh, you've got to read this book," but saying, universities are just about making money. They don't believe in their terrible, terrible places. Now, there's a lot of truth in the book, okay, but where do you go from that if you just say how terrible it is? And then the last chapter in the book apparently is how to get out and not work in university anymore and get out into the real world, as if the outside world to universities is some kind of utopia where people are not behaving in bad ways as well. Or another example, we have an almighty row at the moment over the BBC and whether they're going to be fined or not fined and taken to court. And it's interesting to watch as there's a whole load of people who I didn't quite realize how much this group of people think of the BBC as being a very left-wing organization. Now, my kind of people, we think about it being right-wing, but far better than confronting them is to say, well, let's hear your pain. Let's hear, what is it that upsets you when the BBC does this and why? I worry, maybe a bit unfairly, but I don't worry so much about the views of the very old, because they're not going to be around for much longer. But as soon as you get down into people in their early 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s, don't write them off. How did you get to think that this national broadcaster is such an object for terrible progressive left wing? And you can see I'm failing now because I'm smiling, so I'm not gonna help. But I did this with Brexit. After Brexit, I did a whole load of talks in areas of the south of England that voted leave, where the majority of people who came were old, and there were quite a lot of people who voted to leave. And I discovered that their real reason for voting, most of them, or the one they would admit in public, was that they wanted a better life for their grandchildren and children. And it wasn't so much a really kind of an interesting racism that I'd never seen before in my life, because the anti-Eastern European racism was racism against people who had whiter skins than I do. Right? You'd be amazed what human beings can do. But anyway, so there was some of that new form of don't like those people, they're too white, as opposed to the pinkness of an English person. But it was, they had a better time in their minds with rose tinted glasses when they could establish a family, get a house, and had full employment. And they were blaming the immigrants for this, and they just wanted it to be better. But as soon as you know that the motivating force was wanting things to be better for future generations, you've got something to work with there, rather than just saying you're a bunch of bigots. I go with it, but it's going to take a lot of work, because you can see the anger in some of these debates of, you just don't understand me and you're out of touch, and that isn't gonna work. It just leads to this nihilism, and then you get people saying we should simply have anarchy. And the problem with anarchy is it doesn't work with 8 billion people. It doesn't. You can't run a city on anarchy. You really, really can't.
Exactly.
Yeah, theoretically, maybe 200 years ago, kind of nice idea if you could have a commune somewhere, but not for our societies now. So we have to find a way.
100%. And I'm coming in just to say a big part of what I think could be really helpful is for people to connect to the idea of what we're like, the idea that social good could be at the core of our systems. Private, public, third, all of those things is actually very practical.
Yeah.
It's not as far-fetched as it feels, and especially not as far-fetched as we've been conditioned to associate with the idea of bucking against status quo ideas. It's actually a very practical, sustainable, smart, and not even smart as a judgment about a value judgment, but just literally it is well supported as a means of how we do this.
And it's, in some levels, it seems so obvious. We can feed ourselves as a planet, and although some people worry about the soil quality, honestly, and particularly if we eat a little bit less meat, we can feed ourselves. There's enough water. It's getting hotter. It would be a good idea if we slowed it down, getting hotter quicker. But there are places we can move which are not too hot, that actually need people. It just seems so much in the grasp. But we've been trying. You can go historically. You can go through a whole load of people, and they're often roughly saying the same thing. I mean, so the English tradition is the Charters and the Levellers and the Diggers and the early socialists, but they're essentially saying be nice to each other. And I often end school lectures at the moment by I put up the 10 Commandments of the Socialist Sunday School Society of 100 years ago, and they all just appear to be common sense now. But at the time, it was revolutionary, that you would have a movement that children went to that didn't involve the church on the Sunday. But they're just basically saying, just be nice to each other. And given that anxiety and fear and worries for the future are the main problem for young people, including of the highest social classes, right? It's kind of like it's a win-win if you care about the next generation. It's just how to put forward, and to put forward in a way that's international. Because it can't be. What we've got to be really careful of doing is we can't say we in the UK and the USA have come up with a brilliant new idea. Because we are kind of rogue countries on the international, order. So it's got to be a realization that there are a lot of people around the world saying this at the moment, and how to elevate it up as a way of being.
I would just, as we're coming to an end, Danny, I was just going to reflect, sort of like bringing this conversation together about where we're at now, and like kind of where we hope to see things going and where we can maybe work with them in going. And your point about anarchism made me think that I think I increasingly do identify as an anarchist, but in the sense of seeing anarchy not as, you know, a complete lack of systems or a complete lack of order, but actually just systems that we've chosen to create. I think when I take that definition, I think I would identify in that way, because I think the system as we have it now is one where others have decided, and not even consciously, and we've inherited that and kind of continue to use it every day. That's the problem for me. There's this kind of domination from above without conscious thought.
Yeah.
And I wondered about this thing about young people. I mean, I suppose the elephant in the room is, of course, that they get old and they go out and work, and it's work and being in that system that can often degrade that humanness, that connectivity. And do you see there's something in the phenomenon and the trend that you're seeing in young people now that will be sustained, or are there things that we need to change about the structures of society if that is to be sustained?
I think it's partly because we've given them such a bad deal that it's being sustained at the moment. I'll never forget a senior pollster my age, 57, telling me how impossible she found it to hire anybody in their 30s who wasn't an idealist. And she said didn't mind having some lefties, but they have all this, she said. And because the large majority are being made to pay rent and know that the rent they're paying is helping their landlord have a life, you know, it's not just for their pension. The fact that we in the USA and the UK, uniquely in the world almost, are charging them huge debts to go to university, and they're going to spend their life, you know, we have kind of geared it up for them not to forget. There are a small group of the young, that classically in terms of wealth, there are a set of people in their 30s who own multiple homes and are making money out of renting to other people of their age, right? So, you know, there's a variability. But I do think a bit like the 60s generation, enough of them are going to carry this with them. In the University of Oxford, when I arrived 12, 13 years ago, it was at an odd moment when the heads of colleges were more radical than the governing bodies, because the heads of colleges tended to have been 60s children. So really establishment figures. I mean, this isn't exciting radicalism, but in a governing body meeting, the head of the college would actually be saying, oh, please, can we just be a bit more forward on this than the younger people? And it was just the fact that they had been 60s students on average. I think the common experiences of this generation of watching particular politicians get in, of watching the hopes of their parents often dashed politically, will carry through them for life. So I think, but this is only, you know, the UK and to an extent the USA that I'm talking about. In much of Europe, the situation of greater solidarity already exists. Young people tend to go to schools with their neighbours. They mix socially. Nowhere in mainland Europe has a class system anything like ours, or a private school system anything like the one we have in the UK. And there are countless examples of countries which were utterly divided by civil war in 1918, where those families have come together. But we just tend to think of it as, we just call it Finland, right? We don't go, this is a society so riven that in the 1950s, different families used different shops in the village, the cooperative shop for the left wing, the private shop to buy your groceries, if your family had fought on the side of the whites in 1918. So this coming together has happened in many other places. And remember, all those countries that were on the losing side of a war, that tends to make your young people, and hence the parents and grandparents, much more progressive than the ones who are on the winning side of a war.
And then my last question, which is just about, where do you see the swings that we're experiencing at the moment heading in the future? If you had a crystal ball, where do you, I mean, we've talked, I was trying to keep track of all the different kind of bits of trends that we've been picking up, empathy, inequality, being probably the two biggest ones that we've sort of really touched on, and then where we started, age of childbirth being another. But what are the things, and if there's anything you wanted to say about what's driving those as well? That's quite a large final question from me. So
it's a large one, but age of having children continues to go up. It's a particular obsession of mine because it does affect the future. And in the short term, it's good news. I mean, we have far fewer young people. We're not going to flood the planet with people. In fact, we're going to have to deal with quite an old society for quite a long time. The key question for me is, when are we going to change the conditions of our societies in such a way that somewhere in the world people go, this is a world in which it is worth bringing in more people? And if you want to measure a failure, the fact that we don't have anywhere where people in their 20s or 30s are having an average of, which has come down, has gone back up to having 2 children again, so a real measure of this isn't working. And it won't work by coercing people, and it doesn't work by funding nursery places and so on. That's been tried. It's actually a good society. And again, in the 60s, there was a rise in births, and that was partly because people did think there was a good society occurring. After the Second World War, there was a rise, and it wasn't just because the troops came home. It carried on for a number of years because there was optimism that the future was going to be different. Mass unemployment was not going to be allowed, and we were not going to have another war again. That's a long time ago, but there was a general, and you look at politicians' speeches from the 40s and 50s, and the warnings they gave about the military-industrial complex or about letting firms get too big, there was a sense. Then we have that again, but we call them radical politicians now, the ones who are saying what conservative politicians said in the 50s, now radical youngsters say. And we have to look across at China and see what's happening there. There's a government which is looking at the long term. We tend to dismiss it, but economically, far more countries in the world are impressed by what China's doing than are impressed by what the USA and UK are doing. And we have to hope that the elites of lots of countries do not follow this idea of you're going to be really happy if you get really rich. The one great thing about this set of billionaires being exposed for not being particularly nice people is that the aspiration to want to be that group hopefully will dim. I published a book many years ago called Inequality in the 1%. And sometimes when I gave talks on it in universities, particularly if I did it in a business school, people would come up to me and say, how do I get into the 1%? And I never realized it. And the simple maths are, it's incredibly hard to get into the 1% if you don't start off in it. And even if you start off in the 1%, odds on you're not going to be in it by the time you're an adult. So your life's going to be going down. But you want a world in which the primary aim should not be trying to get above 99 of 100 people out of 100. That's just a recipe for misery. And understanding that simple arithmetic, that trying to become richer than everybody else is not something which should be a personal aspiration for anybody. And we have to help those people who have that aspiration not realize it for the common good of everybody else, including ourselves. I'm not saying we should all be absolutely equal, but we do need to realize that this is a problem. And COP20 released a report last week about inequality. I think the first not COP, the G20, originally led by South Africa, did this about inequality, and there's a call today to have a commission on global inequality with a similar standing to the IPCC on climate. And that's happening up at that level of government. So I wouldn't be pessimistic about the future. I don't think human beings are going to end as a species in the immediate future. But the level of doom and gloom out there in some ways is stunning. Although the most gloomy voices I hear are mainly men, and they're mainly around my age. And that partly makes me not too pessimistic, because I just think, oh, this is grumpy old men going, we're doomed. So I do think my age group and my gender is wrong on this. Right.
Oh, you're on mute, Eddie.
I'm sorry. I had to get the door anyway. It is interesting because the point about, I'll say quickly, the point about the 1% and people kind of being interested in that. I carry the perspective that the 1% is the tip of the iceberg, like that experience, like extreme wealth is the highest idea we have of what like luxury or wealth or what we can produce out of that. But it's such a scaled down version of what's available. If we thought more about what does it mean to ensure that the experience of being human is one that is facilitated for the good of humanity and for the planet, like the public wealth that could be experienced, the collective luxury that could be everyday life, would make billionaire as a status seem almost silly.
Exactly.
You know?
And the way I don't know if I'm wrong to paint it like this, because it's absolutely fine not to have children, but my measure of success would be we create societies where the public wealth is so high that you're enjoying it and you're going, I really want to bring somebody else into this particular world, right? And sacrifice my time caring for them a lot, because this is so good. This is so good that I want to have a couple of children. And when people do that, and they've chosen, because now we have a choice, and they've chosen to do that, then you've got it working. And of course, it's also stable. And until you get to that point, it's just not good enough.
Exactly. And a question, and one of the questions I also wanted to ask is when you were mentioning about, you talked a lot about data, measuring things, and that being important. And I've also found that sometimes a barrier to creating certain change is the available data, like what's trackable versus not, like what's measurable versus not measurable, and who's finding what data to give us what insight to help us make a informed decision about a particular thing. And I was just curious about, in your experience, like for instance, is there data or insight that you would love to have, or you think would be really valuable to the work that we're doing, that is hard to track right now, or is just not available? And then the reverse of that is there data that we are almost like over relying on in terms of how it explains what we're experiencing or what we're going through, that might be better qualified if we change it or kind of dive a little deeper? Again, I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but I'm curious.
That we are over obsessed with things like the share markets, and those they're almost religiously, they appear in the corners of news bulletins, as if somebody's 401 is actually safe at all. It'll be seen as like the religious icons of our age will be that we put up those symbols. And we used to put up a world map which made Russia look really big, the Mercator projection, which again, people weren't consciously doing it, but when they wanted the public to be frightened about USSR, they did it. So all those financial measures, they are a thing of today. They were not a thing that determined the world 100 or 200 years ago, and they will not be the thing which determines how our lives work in 100 years time. They allow companies to behave in a terrible way because they can say they're doing it for shareholders. So that's the thing we rely on far too much. My worry is we have only a tiny amount of data for India and a very small amount of data for most of the poorest half of countries in the world. India matters because the population is so huge. I've seen some data recently for India suggesting a huge rise in inequality under Modi, but you can't be sure it's real. It probably is, but the fact that we don't know if there's some cataclysmic societal breakdown occurring in a country that's that big is stunning. we know, for instance, when the COVID pandemic hit, that both Russia and India life expectancy fell by 4 years, and that tells us that something really bad was going on, because COVID tends to only take a year off life expectancy. But the fact we're having to scrabble around with things like this, and Russia went to war on Ukraine just at the point when it could have been exposed how badly it dealt with the pandemic, and we let people like Modi and India off because it's a democracy, whereas the tiny number of stats that I've seen suggest that the divisions in society there are very high. But we need to be looking at all of society worldwide and not get obsessed by the declining West. The fastest population falls are Europe. The USA is heading that way very soon and going out of its way to deter people from wanting to move there. So it's going to go down. And there's a danger that if you just concentrate like I do on the USA, Canada, and the UK, you could get pessimistic about the future, because these places are shrinking back to the size they used to be in the world, and global equality will only rise if the USA and Europe do not become richer and richer and richer. We're likely to hear a lot of lamenting from the USA and UK in the next 2 decades about why aren't we getting richer and richer? Well, because you can't have so much money that you can afford to go on holiday in other people's countries because they're keeping them poor. That's not how a future good planet is going to work. So the international data and the holes that we have, I look at surveys of 30 countries and get very excited, and the countries include a couple in Africa and a couple in South America, but I could pull apart what I do on the grounds that it's so Western centric. So that's my fear. What helped us see the world, first of all, were the Millennium Development Goals, and that's the year 2000, a long time ago. And just setting those goals meant that we needed numbers for everywhere. And we suddenly got some numbers for Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia. These were the places. But it sounds very, very basic. But check it on the world as a whole, because also that good life that you want, the good society that you'd like, bits of it are already probably happening in somewhere like Kerala in India. They are happening in parts of Costa Rica, possibly. It's probably not going to be the old parts of the hegemonic world where the new society emerges. It could well be happening in parts of China where the government are building enormous parks to try to make the population happy, because the government has an incentive to make the population happy in China, because the only way in which they're opposed is civil war revolution, and that concentrates the mind. So an open mind looking worldwide and looking further out to the places that I've been talking about, and particularly looking for which countries are ahead, which might surprise us. When I tell you that there are 5 countries of Europe which are more equal than Finland and Sweden and Norway and Denmark, almost nobody knows what they are. And then when you look at them, you might malign them, but most people are very well housed, and you don't have to worry so much about what's going to happen to you in an equal country. Because if you end up with a lower paid job, it's not that much lower paid. And if you end up with a higher paid job, it's not that much higher paid. And you're not going to end up in a really, really nice house, and other people won't. And then the anxiety and the fear of a younger generation is much less. And people can do the kind of job they want to do. They can be a nurse. And it sounds ridiculous. We want societies in which somebody can actually aspire to be a nurse and think they're going to have a good life caring for other people. Some things are as simple as that.